Hi everyone. So this week you might be excited to hear we are actually going to get to making some visualizations with our code. And on our way to doing that, I want to revisit one of the topics that it was covered in the videos last week, but we didn't quite get to in class, which is this idea of packaging up code into recipes or functions. So at this point, you all hopefully remember that we had created, a list of objects, which in our case was a series of articles. And we've created a for loop to kind of go through those articles and test and see if they have New York Times as the source, right? So again, we're just using this as an example of, okay, a case where we're going to need to loop through a list of values and test for a particular value or access a particular value of it. So hopefully this will all look a bit familiar. We remember that our for loops here is where I create this counter and I say explicitly that I want to start counting at 0, aka I want to start at the first item of the list. I want to continue looping through the list until the value of that count, as long as the value of that counter is less than the length of the list. And that I want to increment the counter by 1 each time, as opposed to incrementing it by 2 or 3, which again might seem sort of self-evident, but you never know. So we're working with kind of the most fundamental structures of JavaScript here, which means that we have to be really explicit about some things that might otherwise seem obvious to us. So similarly, I took this step in here. You can see that I have my articles. My articles is the name of my array, right? My list of articles. And so I'm using the length here. I've also created a local variable where I'm putting the current article that I'm looking at, right? So in the beginning, if we remember that my articles is a list, right? If I want to access one particular item in that list, I need to pass it a numerical index value, right? I need to give it the position number, right? So the first time through this loop, the position number will be 0, and that means that it will be looking at specifically the 0th item or this first item in the list, and so on and so forth, right? Every time it goes through the loop, it'll increment, and so we'll get through every item in the list. Here I'm saying, look, let's look at the source property of the current object. I compare it to the string New York Times, right? Remember, equals equals is how I compare two things. And I say, if it is the same as the New York Times, then I want you to log the entire article object. Otherwise, I just want you to print a flag message that says this isn't the New York Times. And then I've also put a console log down at the bottom here to indicate when the loop has been completed, just for my own information. So if I flip to the front side of my page here and I reload it with the console exposed, I can see that, as I expect, I have, the first and the fourth object are printed because they both have the source New York Times. I can expand these in the browser and confirm that. This 2 means that the 2 middle ones, the not New York Times message, got printed twice in a row. And likewise, I can confirm this down here. And of course, I get my little loops done message. So something that we started, that I started to look at in last week's videos, and I want to sort of, I was going to say close the loop on, is this idea of packaging up this kind of functionality. Now, the reason why we want to do this is, there are a number of reasons why we want to do this. The primary one is that it lets us reuse code, right? So one of the really powerful things in programming is that we can create something that's just generic enough that we can use it with multiple data sources, or we can use it multiple times, right? We don't want to end up having to write every single thing that we need to happen in a program, top to bottom, start to finish, especially if we end up having to do the same thing more than once, right? This is essentially the power of computers in general. So what I want to do is I want to package this up in a function, okay? And so again, the way that I do that is I start with the function keyword. So this is me announcing to the computer, look, what I'm about to do is create, I'm about to define a function here, right? So I say function, say check ny times, okay? And at first, all I'm going to do is make sure that I have wrapped up everything that I want to have happen in that function in curly braces. So again, just noting, if you go back to our JavaScript as a natural language presentation, these round parentheses are how we indicate a function. When they're empty, what it means is this recipe can be conducted with, can be completed without any additional ingredients, right? Everything that you need is right there. It's already accounted for, and you don't need any additional material. Just to make sure that I have, and I want to also draw some attention to how I did that. So you'll notice that when I start to put in these curly braces, it automatically pairs them. I always want to take this first one and just move it down somewhere past the end of all of the stuff that I want to have happen in the function, right? It doesn't have to be right at the end, right? It could be many lines down, but I want to do that. And then what I want to do is I'm going to use this source property to format. And what will happen is if everything is correctly balanced, it's going to format this nicely for me. If it isn't, it's going to run into problems, right? And so one way to do kind of a quick check to see if you've got things balanced correctly is to use that format function and see what happens. Obviously, I can also do this by flipping to the front of my page and reloading it and see if I get any errors. Now, you may notice that when I reload this page, nothing happens anymore. And the reason why is because now that I have wrapped this up in a function, the computer knows about this code, right? It's ready to use it whenever I want. But when I declare the function, when I sort of say function check New York Times, right? I have given it a recipe, but I haven't told it to make it, right? I haven't told it to actually cook the recipe or execute the recipe, right? If I wanted to execute the recipe, I actually have to explicitly call the function, okay? So this is me down here. I have to explicitly call the inline times function, okay? And now you'll see if I do that, all of a sudden my output appears again, okay? So the reason why I want to be able to do this is because it lets me reuse this code, right? So the way that I have this written currently, it works for my articles, right? But what if I have a second set of articles that I want to loop through and check in the same fashion? Well, the problem is that this is written with my articles specifically. It won't work for my articles too. In order to get around this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I am going to specify that actually you need to hand me that this function, in order to work, you need to explicitly give it a list of articles to work with. And so the way that I indicate that it needs a list of articles to work with is I can just say, I give it a parameter, right? We sometimes call these arguments, which I never quite make sense of. But a parameter or an argument basically says, look, you need to pass a list of articles into this function, okay? Now, I've made this descriptive. Obviously, this variable name could be anything, but I choose to make it article list because it helps me keep track of what it is, what type of ingredients this check New York Times recipe needs. Okay, so now, of course, article list becomes the internal label, becomes the internal name. And when I say internal, I mean inside this function, right? So inside the brackets of this function, the list that is being worked on is referred to as article list. So the function doesn't care what the name of the list is out in the broader world, right? So I like the analogy here to thinking about your uni at Columbia versus, say, your passport number or some other ID number that you might have in a different context, right? At Columbia University, if somebody needs to understand, needs to identify you, they're going to ask, what's your uni? Similarly, within this function, okay, if I need to do some work to that list, right, I need to do things like, know how long it is, it's going to want to know, it's going to use this name that I've defined inside those round parentheses. That's the name that's going to be relevant inside the function, right? It doesn't care what the name is outside the function. It could be, Timbuktu. Inside the function, it's article list, right? So I just need to make sure that all the places where I had my articles before I've now replaced with article list. And if I do that, then everything should be fine. So I'm going to flip back to Chrome here, and I'm going to, aha. So now I've run into a problem. And this is one of those examples where this could actually be a much clearer error, but unfortunately that's not something people seem to be spending a lot of time on, right? So it says cannot read property length of undefined. Importantly, it gives us a line number. So I'm going to flip back to Aptana, and I see on line 128, oh right, okay, this is where I'm saying article list.length. Well, article list is up here, that seems fine. But the question is where I've called my function, right? So remember, this is just the definition of my times function recipe, right? I haven't actually tried to execute it. So when I do try to execute it, right, I have to be sure to pass it the necessary ingredients, right? It needs an article list. So this is where I can go back up here and say, oh, okay, I'm going to pass it. In fact, I'm going to do the different one, right? I know that my articles 2 is also a list of articles. So I'm going to go ahead and give it that. Let's see how that goes. Aha! And now we see that I can use that same function, right? I used it once with article list 2. I can come back here and do it with my articles, right? And we'll see that both of these things will be executed, but I only had to write this chunk of code once, okay? So this is the real power of functions. Because they wrap up, there we go. Because they wrap up code and allow it to be reused, they are also the basis of how we are able to use, here we've created our own code, our own function, which is great. This is also what's going to let us use other people's code. So when we come back, we're actually going to look at using some code from Google so that we can make our own interactive charts. See you in a minute.